Number 10. Sacred books. The Romans paved the way for many following civilizations, okay? They invented surgical tools, they invented medicine on the battlefield, and before this era, literature took the form of a tablet or a scroll. The Romans, they created the codex. Pages stacked on top of one another, just bound pages. The reason you have homework right now to be doing instead of watching this. It's all thanks to the ancient Romans. The early codex was bound wax, and then it moved to animal skin. This was a big step because early Christians used this new invention to produce copies of the Bible. Important pieces of history, so rightfully so, they had to be locked away from the public. Now, back when King Tarquin ruled Rome, a local woman offered the Etruscan king 9 books. Now, these books were ignored at first, but upon its second glance, the beat-up manuscripts foretold the rise and fall of Rome. So, for most of its time, these spoiler-filled manuscripts were held in the Temple of Jupiter. So if anybody wants to do National Treasure 3, I have some ideas, just saying. We could do like 9 installments. Number 9, corrupt fire department. Oh, here we go. When we think back to ancient times, it's not long before we come across an ancient blaze or some ancient wild tragedy where you're like, oh my god, how did that even happen? Something that reminds you that it wasn't always a party, okay? It was rarely a party, in fact. When we think of Julius Caesar, when regarding the leadership of Rome, we often forget Marcus Crassus. He was powerful and full of bright ideas on the sidelines. Marcus ran the fire brigade. A lot of open fires, a lot of accidents happening at this time, so of course we need responders. But back then, these officials arrived on site to this blazing emergency, but before helping out, Crassus would demand the owner sells their property to him first. Yeah, watch it burn or sell it for a not so handsome price. The choice is yours, and also you have 38 seconds to decide. TikTok. Number 8, ancient drag. I'll respect a girl's night out, okay? Always. I get it. My guy friends have ruined most nights out that I've had in the city, because guys are dumbasses. That's a fact. Ancient Romans were ahead of the game with this one as well. That's why they made the festival of the good goddess women only. Yeah, statues of men weren't even allowed to partake. Statues depicting men at this festival had to be draped. Yeah, none of us were seeing anything. But then in comes Mr. Jealous, Mr. Ancient FOMO himself. Enter Publius Clodius Pulcher, okay? This man disguised himself as a flute lady, but when he didn't play the flute, and also wasn't a lady, and also nobody knew him, it was a little obvious that an intruder was present. A trial soon followed and the festival was then suspended. See, guys ruin the party, even in ancient Roman days. This dude's like, nah, I'm gonna go ruin it. Number 7, sewer goddess. I love reading about ancient gods. It's my favorite topic. The Roman god of manure and fertilizer, for example. Where was that one in Hades? That would have been helpful. I would have beat that game in 8 minutes flat with him. The god of toilets. There's one we can't forget about either. Crepitus, okay? Every day we have to thank the god of toilets, right? If you haven't today, go ahead and thank them. The Romans regarded Glossina as the goddess of the main drain. The literal main drain to the city of Rome, all this water. This goddess was Glauca Maximum, aka Big Drain. Eventually, this god was affiliated with Venus, the goddess of beauty and love. Yeah, love me some big ass drains. Nice. That's a lie, actually. As a kid, I was so afraid of the bathtub drain. I would pull it and then just immediately high jump out of the tub. I don't want to get sucked down like Ant-Man. Know what I mean? Number 6, death before combat. With most of these Roman gladiators, they're trained, they understand a specific style of combat, and they're paired with an opponent that's somewhat equal. And then hundreds of people go, yeah, and they bet on you, and then see blood and stuff. It's horrible. But not all these gladiators are UFC fighters, okay? Not all of them are Kurt Russell and handsome. No, a great amount of these gladiators were criminals who were forced to fight each other in the name of entertainment, or they were slaves. Yeah, these prisoners of war were not really on board with fighting a lion with a dagger, believe it or not. They understood this was a one-way trip most likely, so many of them took their own lives before the combat even begun. This one story is quite haunting, but it makes total sense. Sadly, 29 prisoners, they were all set to fight these crazy animal battles in front of thousands, but they all strangled each other. They all took each other's lives with their bare hands because that was easier to them than walking into this nightmare publicly. That's horrible. The reason this was the easier choice to make, sadly, was because saying no to the combat or to the games would just lead to an even more painful public execution. So it's a lose-lose, sadly. They sucked. Number 5, loincloths. Going back to ancient Roman and Egyptian times, there we go, 2 for 1. The loincloth was of course used by all. Either that or you would just be naked. I found this neat step-by-step on how to make your own loincloth, and I tried it, and it's way more complicated than I could have ever imagined, okay? We don't have a lot of archaeological evidence because these linens barely made it through a decade, obviously. There's not a lot of bones in them that would hang out over these thousands of years. But ancient Romans would often use leather to make underwear. Can you imagine that? Hot goat skin wrapped around your waist in the sun? Oh, I need baby powder just thinking about it right now. We still use leather today when it comes to undergarments and, you know, zippers and stuff, but that's for another video. We'll get to that another time. Number 4, cesspools. Hey, here's a note. If you're gonna make a massive castle, you need to know where not to build certain rooms. In case you're building a castle. Anyone watching? Like say over a cesspool as an example. Yeah, don't build anything heavy over here or else let's talk about it. Cesspools were often placed under floors, which makes sense because, you know, gravity and life and stuff. But you need to make sure those floors are supportive enough, period. That's it. Or else, this will happen. Back in 1183, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had a dinner in the Palace of Erfurt. But in the main floor of the main hall broke open, resulting in a bunch of dinner guests falling through said floor, with even a few drowning again in said cesspool. Yeah, it's a horrible way to go. And then again in 1326 in England, Richard the Raker had just sat down. The guy hasn't even started his meal yet, and then again the floor beneath him broke and he fell through and drowned in a cesspool. That's like the worst way to drown too. I'd say chamber pots were safer, but when it comes to waste, out of sight, out of mind. Sadly, just get that away from me. Just downhill, get it out, or else we'll drown in it, probably. Number 3, Roman shampoo. Okay, when my hair grew out over the pandemic, I had a panic attack. I don't know what the f to do. I had a huge wake-up call. I've never had long hair before. I didn't know what to use in this mop. I still don't. Clearly, evidently, all I had growing up was the classic 4-in-1 shampoo for guys. That wasn't working out at all. That sucked. I needed some curl cream, okay? Separate jars of items, not just a 5-in-1 with mouthwash on your head. Those aren't good. Those don't do anyone any good. But the ancient Romans, they didn't have Head and Shoulders back then. What did they do? Well, sometimes nothing. They would dip their hair in cold water and at public bathhouses also, very public. Then they would rub and scrape away oils. Lime water was also used to wash your hair, but that was just as useful as lime wire. Sometimes Europeans wouldn't even use water at all to clean their head. They would rub their head with bran, like just a loose bran, before bed, and then they'd brush it out with a comb in the morning. Yeah, bran. I used dog shampoo once by accident. I thought that was bad. Bran? Be so itchy, I wouldn't sleep a wink. Number 2, ancient socks. Somebody got me socks over the holidays as a gift, and let me tell you, last year, I became a man. I was like, thank you, I actually love this. This is now the best gift of my life. Socks and lip balm, that's it. I don't want a PlayStation, get lost. Socks in ancient Greece, first of all, they weren't, you know, the ankle socks. There weren't Vans skateboarding socks. There weren't the weird grippy ones that kids have. Where were those growing up, first of all? Not even close. Socks came around in the 8th century BC, and it was made fresh from animal hairs. This led to Romans tying animal skins around their feet, and then, you know, tying it more and more and more and higher. Anything to keep it there. Now cut to the 2nd century AD in ancient Rome, the sock game finally got real. Romans began using fabrics instead of animal skins. It was now softer, it was lighter, and then later in the 5th century, socks were worn only by the most holy, which is kind of ironic because socks have holes in them. You get the joke, there it is. Socks were associated with the church. They were considered a symbol of purity. Socks would go all the way up your leg back then. Like I said, a little different than the New Balance ankle socks we got today. A little less holy. Finally, number 1, public bathhouse. This last one, okay, we haven't moved on from this at all. That's why I wanted to finish this list. Nice little fresh, fun reminder from Taylor McWaters. Here we go. We still bathe together a lot. We go to water parks and we swim around in pools filled with pee. Ancient Roman bathhouses were the older, slightly yuckier versions of water parks. They would literally spread intestinal parasites. They were actually way worse. In these massive rooms with giant pools just lie disease. Nude, there were and everyone was sweaty and it was all tight and there was no filtration system. It was like an indoor hot tub without the pumps or the salts. It was gross. The Romans were literally figuring out sewage systems at the same time, which I of course mentioned earlier, but they were also the first to create heated public baths. Yeah, my above ground pool wasn't heated, but the ancient Romans, they had heated pools. Great, I gotta send an email to my dad this afternoon. Now I'm pissed. The archaeology and anthropology department at Cambridge discovered that Romans brought lots of parasites to Europe. Yeah, the fossilized feces showed that these heated, relaxing, rejuvenating bathhouses nearby were all but. Yeah, they were horrible. They were just spreading hot disease, coming in hot. I don't mean to undermine the ancient Romans. To be fair, they also brought with them lice and fleas. Ayo, this one for the road.
At number 10, less developed. Back in ancient times, there were so many civilizations around the world who were growing and developing their own customs, tools, and other innovative ideas. Each civilization advanced at their own pace, but when it comes to Mesoamerican civilizations like the Mayans, some have wondered why they weren't as advanced as others from different parts of the world. While the Spaniards, who later colonized many Mesoamerican places, were using guns, the Mayans were still using swords and shields. Many Mesoamerican civilizations never even developed iron tools and stayed using things like stone and obsidian. This is a mystery that has boggled the minds of many researchers. The theory as to why they might not have advanced as much as other civilizations is that it had to do with their environment. To develop a civilization to the level that others around the world had, the advancement of agriculture and animal domestication had to be successful, and because the lands in which the Mayans lived were home to very few native animal and plant species, it made it hard for these people to advance and therefore caused some difficulties for them. At number 9, body modification. The Mayans, much like other Mesoamerican civilizations, were big on body modification. The modification process often started from birth and continued to be a staple in their society for many years. Some of their body modification practices included skull shaping, where they would use wooden planks to alter the shapes of baby skulls, dental modifications, where they would drill holes into their teeth and insert gems like jade and iron pyrite into them, and even tattoos. They also had a lot of piercings in their culture, from earlobe to nose piercings and even tongue piercings as well. Some of the elite members of society would pierce their tongues with a stingray spine and then pull a thorn-freckled or obsidian-crusted vine through it. One of the most intense body modifications that they practiced was forcing their kids to become cross-eyed. From a young age, parents would hang beads from their kids' hair across their foreheads so that their kids' eyes would focus on it, and over time they would become cross-eyed. This was a sign of beauty because they associated the look with the way a jaguar's eyes looked before they attacked their prey. At number 8, naming their kids. These days, there are so many ways to name your spawn. There are baby name books and websites. Every year there is a trending list of baby names for parents to choose from, and some even just go with family names for their kids. But back in the days of the ancient Mayan civilization, naming your kid was a very simple process because it just depended on what day the kid was born. The Mayans had a name for every day of their calendar year, so depending on which day you were evicted from the womb, that's the name that you were assigned. That means that there would have been a lot of people in their city with the same name. For boys born in the Mayan civilization, they were just given the name of the day they were born, but for girls, they had to have the number 9 in front of their given name as a sign of feminine power, which I find pretty interesting. Imagine if that was how we name people these days. Based on the Mayan naming system, how many people do you know that might have been given the same name as you? At number 7, sacrifices. The ancient Mayan people were another society who practiced human sacrifices as part of their religious practices. Already, the notion of sacrificing a member of your society to appease the gods sounds pretty gruesome, but when you learn about some of the details of their sacrificial practices, it gets a little scarier and a little mysterious too. In their religion, they would sacrifice people like prisoners, slaves, or even regular everyday people. They would start by painting the sacrificial person blue, and they were sometimes subjected to torture as well, depending on the context of their sacrifice. Then they would be led up to the top of one of their pyramids and either be showered with a volley of arrows or have their heart ripped out through their chest while it was still beating. Talk about heartbreak, right? Yeah? No. Okay. To make things even more gruesome, sometimes the assistant priest at the sacrificial ceremony would then skin the sacrifice, and the head priest would then wear the skin and perform a ritual dance. Yeah, it's super gory and definitely something that I'm glad that I won't have to experience. At number 6, Mayan graffiti. Now here's something really mysterious that I find quite interesting. Turns out that the Mayans did graffiti. Yeah. So next time you're out and you see graffiti in your own city, you can look at that and know that the Mayans did the same thing. The Mayans were obsessed with writing, and so they would write and draw on anything they could, including their own stone walls. Archaeologists have found many etchings in stone in many ancient Mayan cities. These etchings were made by people carving into plaster using stone tools or obsidian, and the graffiti usually depicted things like people, animals, deities, line carvings, handprints, and other glyphs. At first, when researchers discovered these carvings, they thought that they were made by children who lived in the communities, but after further research, they realized that these markings had more of a purpose rather than just being random drawings. No one really knows why they did graffiti, only that it was just there, which really kind of just adds to the mystery of the whole thing. At number 5, Mayan creationism. Whether you believe in evolution or creationism, no one really knows for sure how the world began. There are a number of theories from both sides, but again, it's such a huge notion that it's next to impossible to know where everything began. Every culture has their theory, and the Mayans were no exception, and they even came up with their own story for the creation of life. The Mayans believed that the Earth was created in 3114 BCE, and this date coincides with the beginning of the Mayan calendar. According to their mythology, the world was created in 4 parts. First came the animals, then wet clay, then wood, and then finally humans, which were said to be made out of maize, which is essentially corn. They believed that all of this was created by artisan gods who crafted the earth and the heavens like sculptures. It's a pretty cool story, but again, we will never know if their theory was actually true. At number 4, afterlife. For the Mayans, their version of the afterlife was quite intense and complex. They thought of the afterlife as the soul's journey to paradise, but there was also no guarantee that said soul would actually reach eternal peace. First, a person's soul would have to pass through a terrifying underworld that was said to be the home of frightening deities who had names like Bloody Teeth, Flying Scab, and Bloody Claw. Already quite scary, right? Thankfully, not everyone had to endure this terrifying journey to the underworld. Those who were exempt were victims of sacrifice, women who died in childbirth, those killed in warfare, and people who died playing the game Pocketalk, which was their bloodiest sport. So really, you had to earn your death in this culture, otherwise your journey to the afterlife would be brutal. Which makes a lot of sense as to why death and sacrifice were such a huge part of their culture, because no one wanted to die a lame death and have to face Bloody Teeth and Bloody Claw in the afterlife. Even though some Mayan souls were believed to have found their way to paradise, they also believed that life was a never-ending cycle going from life to death and back again, so even if you did reach paradise, you might not have stayed there for long before being thrown right back into the circle of life once again. At number 3, burial rituals. On the topic of Mayan death beliefs and rituals, we should talk about their mysterious burial rituals as well. For the Mayans, death was a big part of life, and when you were laid to rest, that wasn't the end of your burial ritual. While your soul was passing through either the underworld or paradise, things were still going on with your remains even years after your passing. The Mayans had tombs for their dead, they often wrapped the bodies, placed them in specific positions, and even provided the person with food for the afterlife. But even after their burial, the Mayans would often exhume their loved one's skeletal remains years later and paint them bright red, and this was especially common for key Mayan rulers and officials. But that's not the only way that they practiced ceremonial burials. Sometimes, before being buried, they would cremate the person and the remains would be placed in decorative urns. It all just depended on the person and their level of importance in their society. At number 2, currency. Before I get into the ancient Mayan currency, I want you guys to leave a comment down below telling me what your currency is. I think it's so cool to see how many different types of currency there are around the world, so let me know yours. Now let's get into how Mayans paid for things. They used chocolate as their currency back in their heyday. The cacao bean was a big staple in Mayan culture, and they had been cultivating it for years. It became so important to them that they even created a deity devoted to the bean. They started off using the cacao bean as a food source, creating chocolate beverages and food, but soon the cacao bean evolved in their society, going from being something edible with bartering value to being a legitimate currency. There are ancient Mayan artworks that depict the cacao bean being used as money in their society, and it's just fascinating. Do you think that you would have liked to pay for things in chocolate? If that was a thing, I wouldn't have any money. And finally, at number 1, downfall. The biggest mystery that surrounds the ancient Mayan civilization is what the heck happened to them. To this day, no one quite knows for sure what happened to them and how their civilization died off. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the centers of the Mayan southern lowlands started to decline, and they were abandoned not too long afterwards. This decline was coupled with the decline of architectural advancements and construction. There are a few theories to explain what might have happened to the Mayans, like overpopulation, foreign invasion, peasant revolt, or even the collapse of key trade routes. More environmental explanations for the Mayans' decline include environmental disaster, sickness, or even climate change. Some research have even theorized that there was a 200-year drought that might have contributed to the civilization's collapse. Right now though, we have no idea. So by far the most mysterious thing that the Mayans did was disappear.
Kicking off the list at number 10, party hard. The term boot and rally was added to the Urban Dictionary in 2002, but Romans were riding that wave out a long time ago. They knew how to get down. Well, rather, they knew how to get it up. Ancient Romans would often make themselves puke in order to continue eating and drinking. How gross is that? What would normally be a red flag at a house party was actually a sign of respect back then. But it was business. These parties, these long, exhausting banquets, attending these was a sign of social standing. So you wanted to be around the longest. You wanted to drink the most, dance the most, and, grossly enough, puke the most. Those are the coolest Romans in town, apparently. It was so normal that you would excuse yourself from dinner and be like, excuse me, go to the vomitorium, great name, right across from the dining room. I'm sure it's a great breeze rolling through there. But then you'd go in this room, grab a feather, and then tickle thy throat, and then make room for even more lobster. What a treat. Birthday parties were never so disgusting. Number 9, gladiator blood. When Charlie Sheen started talking about drinking dragon blood, everybody looked at him like he was insane, rightfully so, but back then if you boasted about drinking gladiator blood, well, you were on the right track. Ancient Romans believed that gladiators had the literal heart of a lion, and to be fair, they were in immaculate shape, with all that long hair as well. I don't blame them. So the thought process here, being extremely superstitious, was that if you drank gladiator blood, whatever disease you had, it would soon be cured. So these Roman physicians would tell their patients with epilepsy to chug some warrior blood, like you're a vampire. Apparently it worked, like some of the time. Never really, not really. I wouldn't recommend this, don't do this. Number 8, you're in trouble. Recently, we did a list on dark medical practices used in history, and in that list we talked briefly about how urine was used by ancient Romans to whiten their smile. Lovely. Fresh breath guaranteed. Well, to dive deeper into this gross fact, Romans also used urine to wash their clothes. So after they were done washing up, they would mask the smell, or at least try to, with fragrant leaves. They would use bay leaves and just rub it all over themselves, which is interesting. They didn't use soap because the amount of ammonia used in urine, well, it did the trick. Lye was also used to clean clothes at this time, but it was too pricey. So plan B was to head down to the Folones, the ancient laundromat, where everybody would just catch up and stomp on their urine-filled clothes. Again, the smell is probably not that pleasant. Number 7, Roman art. If you've seen Superbad recently, this next one will ring a bell. I grew up watching Art Attack, okay? The British dude, Neil Buchanan, with his aggressive sidekick head that would just yell at you all day. What a fun way to learn how to draw. Well, back in the 18th century, when excavations took place in the city of Pompeii, they found lots and lots of art with a similar eggplant theme. I'm trying not to say what I really want to say here, people. Genitals carved everywhere. Carved, I said, not just like, drawn in Sharpie. Carved in the streets, carved in the walls. Just under a street sign, you'll see one of these. Just popping out at you. Hello. Just generations of genitals. Rich history, folks. The phalluses of Pompeii. Imagine tripping over one of these. You do that thing where you look back to see what you almost rolled your ankle on. Imagine looking back and seeing that in the ground. I'd be like, okay, we're just gonna keep walking. Many tour guides like to say that they all point and lead to a brothel, when in reality these were actually just for good luck. They didn't really have a purpose other than good fortune. These symbols were to ward off the evil eye. Most folk kept these outside their front homes, right next to the mailbox. That's great, it's a good spot to put it. Number 6, new hair, new me. Glowing up these days is quite easy. Change your hair color up, throw on some jorts, listen to Adele's new album, Bob's Your Uncle. It works. It always works. But if you were an ancient Roman and you want to show off the new you to your ex, maybe at the vomitorium party, how would you change your hair? How would you do it? Well, it was common, but the way they used to get it done was all but. Romans would have to use goat fat and beechwood ashes to bring out those highlights. Maybe it's goat fat, maybe it's Maybelline. Again, like those crazy parties, this was a symbol of status. If your hair didn't reek of goat fat, who even are you? Get out of here. Emperor Claudius III, his wife Valeria, apparently she once dyed her hair blonde and then painted her entire body gold and then had a contest to see who could hook up with the most Romans in one night. I feel like this would have been a really good reality TV show back in the day. Number 5, bathroom hangouts. Bathroom lighting is key when you go out. Those 1 a.m. selfies never looked or felt so good. Ancient Roman times, hanging out in the bathroom with your friends was quite common, but they didn't have any neon lights or quotes and selfies. It was just a lot of bricks. Oh, and also, it smelled really bad. They didn't have the Charmin Ultra less is more lifestyle. They had to use sticks with sponges to wipe. And yeah, of course, they also had to share. Socializing in these ancient toilets was like socializing at a Starbucks. It was normal. You would spend hours here and you got done, literally. Groups of Romans would discuss business, politics, military strategies, all the while a dude's in the corner just like going to the bathroom. Romans believed the goddess Cloacina was the guardian of the toilet drain system. Cloaca Maxima translates to big drain. I guess when you invent the flushing toilet, you can call them whatever you want. Just don't call any meetings there, perhaps. Might be a good start. Number 4, no soap. Sometimes you're in a rush, it happens. You don't have time to shower, so you do the classic spray yourself with cologne and then hope that you fool the world. It's a smart move, but the ancient Romans were way ahead of you. While they didn't clean their clothes with laundry detergent, it's not shocking to hear that they also didn't use soap to wash their bodies. Instead, they rubbed perfume oil all over themselves to get rid of sweat and all that jazz, but later on, once that oil had dried up, it was then removed with a wooden wedge or a spatula-like tool called a striggle. The world's most painful loofah, sign me up. Dirt and sweat would get stuck to this oil and then subsequently just peeled off. So it did work, but it took a little more time than our usual showers nowadays, our 5-minute rushes before work. For Romans who were well off, this was a whole event. There were several assistants you could pick from all these fancy and fragrant oils. It was slow and sensual. How was anybody ever on time back then? Number 3, all the poison. There's always the one kid who's allergic to nuts on your flight. And it's horrible, now nobody gets nuts on this flight. It's tragic, really. Research shows that feeding infants peanuts or peanut products when they're around 4 to 6 months old can prevent a peanut allergy. But Roman emperors had their own way of achieving immunity. It was common for Roman kings to seek out and then consume a small amount of each known poison because they thought at the end of this grueling trial you would become immune to them all. It was a hot blend called Mithridatum, named of course after the poison's creator, Mithridates the Great. He lived until he was 80, so maybe these potions that he created might have actually worked. The world's first vaccine perhaps. Number 2, thumbs up or thumbs down. Giving somebody a thumbs up after they've done something, it feels nice. You're like, yeah. Even a sarcastic thumbs up, use those when you get cut off in traffic. In the hit film Gladiator, there's a scene where Joaquin Phoenix's character gives Russell Crowe's character a thumbs up, and in turn he lives, and then we watch cinematic redemption. In real life, ancient Romans used these thumb signs to determine a gladiator's fate in the Colosseum. It was referred to as pollice verso. It's the Latin term for a turned thumb. The crowd would vote if a gladiator should die or not, which is also insane. It's like America's Got Talent, but like insane. While it's nice to receive a thumbs up after doing something today, if you got a thumbs up or even a thumbs down, it meant your days of living have come to an end. And finally, number 1, animals in the arena. In order to spice up the classic fight and clashing swords till death action, sometimes gladiators would be put into the arena with an animal instead of another human being. Were they squirrels, maybe an opossum, or were they tigers or elephants, bears, lions, leopards, hyenas, wolves? Oh my god, they didn't win these often, did they? Animals were very expensive, so they weren't used all the time, but the organizers of the battle would go all out for the fights if they did include them. Like Logan Paul vs. Mayweather, it's a big social event. Most animals who were used in these great battles unfortunately didn't make it out alive. That's the horrible part as well. I'm a big animal lover, so much so that I'm rooting for the elephants in these fights while reading up about this. This led to another important factor down the road. People loved when animals were included, that eventually trade in exotic animals started taking place. This quickly took the hippo from the Nile and made them extinct. Now cut to today, thousands of species are going extinct.
At number 10, cutting fingernails. Each civilization had their own specific beliefs, religions, and rites. For the Vikings, their belief in Norse mythology impacted a lot of their daily lives and even their burial rituals. One specific prophecy from their religion depicted the end of the world, and as anyone would, they tried to avoid that at all costs. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok was their version of the end of the world, and during this event it was foretold that a lot of stuff was gonna happen, like giants and demons approaching and attacking the gods, and a ship called Nagfar would carry a fleet of giants. This ship was said to be made of the fingernails and toenails of the dead, and the bigger the ship, the more giants would come. Out of fear of this happening, the Vikings took every precaution to prevent Ragnarok and subsequently the arrival of this fingernail ship. To do this, the Vikings built into their burial rites a very important step, cutting the fingernails of the dead. The Vikings had to remove the fingernails of the dead so that they couldn't be used to build the giant ship, but other than their removal, no one really knows what they did with said fingernails. The Vikings were also said to have kept their own fingernails clean as to prevent the same outcome. At number 9, teeth filing. Many civilizations had body modifications as part of their culture through time. Mesoamerican civilizations were known to shape their skulls and alter their eyes, women in China altered the shapes of their feet for many years, and so many cultures around the world adorned themselves with tattoos, piercings, and scarifications. In Viking culture, their body modifications often included dental work. Evidence suggests that some Vikings filed horizontal lines into their teeth, and some of them filled those grooves with red dye to make themselves look even more terrifying. Because the Vikings were known to be voyagers traveling the seas to new lands, some anthropologists believe that the Vikings may have picked up their idea for dental modification after making contact with people in West Africa, as many tribes over there were known to file their teeth into different shapes. Would you guys ever do something like this, or would you rather leave that up to the Vikings? At number 8, carbon monoxide. The Vikings were pretty good builders, mainly of ships. Their ships were huge, intricate, and very impressive, but where they excelled in shipbuilding, they lacked in the construction of their homes and community buildings. Apparently, the longhouses that they built for their communities were actually pretty unsafe to be in and trapped a lot of toxic gases inside of them. Researchers from a university in Denmark recreated one of the Vikings' longhouses and lit a fire in the center of it, like the Vikings would have done back in the day. After simulating an average living environment and monitoring the atmosphere inside of the longhouse, they realized that there wasn't enough ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide from building up inside. This would have led to a lot of people getting sick, especially those who spent long periods of time inside. The Vikings didn't know that though, but they also had their own remedies for curing sickness, so I don't think that they would have thought much of it. At number 7, onion soup. Speaking of Viking home remedies though, they had some pretty interesting ones. Every civilization had their own takes on medicine and healing their sick and injured, and the Vikings were no doubt the same. For them though, soup was their tool for healing, and for x-rays. Sort of. These days we eat soup when we're sick to warm up our bodies and balance out our sodium levels, and doctors have actually proven that eating chicken soup actually does make you feel better when you have a cold, but Vikings didn't really have the same idea. For them, onion soup was their thing, and they used it to diagnose people. Viking healers would make up a pot of really strong onion soup and feed it to a warrior who had a wound around their abdomen. Once the person drank the soup, the healer would see if they could smell the soup through the wound. If he could, then the wound was fatal and there was no sense in trying to save the person, so they would just move on to the next warrior. It saved the healer time trying to attend to everyone, but it kinda sucked for the person who got left behind, because not only are they not going to make it, but their last meal was that awful onion soup. At number 6, blood eagle. We all know that the Vikings were a ruthless group of people, but their methods of execution really painted a clear picture of how terrifying these guys were and how they had a colorful imagination when it came to imagining new ways to unalive somebody. The Vikings came up with a method of execution called the blood eagle, and yes, it is just as terrifying as you would expect with a name like that. The blood eagle basically involved cutting someone up to make it look like an eagle. They would cut apart the rib cage and then spread it apart to make it look like wings, and then after that, while this person was still alive mind you, they would pour a salt solution over the wound, pull out the lungs, and arrange them over the rib cage to, again, make it look like wings so that this person could flutter away into the afterlife. Now the mysterious part of all this is that historians aren't exactly sure if this was actually a real method of execution or if it was just embellished in Viking records to make them sound cooler. I, for one, hope that it wasn't actually real because that sounds brutal, but when it comes to Vikings, you never really know. At number 5, building fires. The Vikings were some pretty innovative people, but they were also kinda gross. This gross behavior applied to a lot of things, but one of those things was their fire building. Now you're probably asking yourself, Bree, what's so gross about making a fire? Well, it's the way that they started the fire that was kinda grody. You see, nowadays we have a bunch of things that we can use to start a fire. We have matches, lighters, lighter fluid, and a bunch of other things. But obviously back in the days of the Vikings, they didn't have those fire starting tools, and so they had to improvise. The Vikings came up with a nifty little trick to start a fire where they took a fungus called touchwood and they would beat it and burn it until it turned into a thin, flat thing that kind of looked like felt. Then they decided to get gross and would then boil the touchwood in human urine because urine contained sodium nitrate, which would help the touchwood turn into something that would smolder rather than burn. They could then take this stuff with them and use it to start fires whenever they wanted so they could cook food over their urine-fueled fire. Sounds delightful. At number 4, conning. Conning people has been something that's kind of been part of many societies since probably the dawn of civilization. Anyone can con anyone into doing anything or buying anything. I mean, people do it on eBay all the time. But apparently, the Vikings were also known to con people probably for their own enjoyment, because they're Vikings. Back in the day, the Vikings would do trades with the Inuit people and they would acquire narwhal tusks from them. The Vikings would then sell those tusks to other people, marketing them as unicorn horns, and let's face it, no one's gonna turn down buying a unicorn horn. Because of the Vikings and their cunning ways, by the Middle Ages, people not only believed that unicorns were actually real, but that they also had magical powers. So in a way, if you were obsessed with unicorns as a kid, you can thank the Vikings for that. At number 3, house bears. Humans seem to be pretty good at domesticating animals. We domesticated dogs by accident, and now they're considered man's best friend. We domesticated livestock for food and other purposes. We domesticated horses to be our transportation and carry things. So we kind of know our way around animals and could probably make anything into our pet if we really wanted to. But the Vikings weren't just satisfied with dogs, horses, and livestock. They were the mighty Vikings and they needed mighty pets, and that's why they kept bears as their companions. Yes, bears. Now don't get me wrong, the Vikings also had normal pets like dogs and cats, and they would even sometimes bring them along on their expeditions, but they also really liked bears. It is said that when they weren't out laying siege to someone's town or sailing the seas, the Vikings would visit bear dens and take bear cubs home with them. They would then raise the cubs as house bears. But having a house bear was also a very big responsibility. You had to make sure that your bear was kept in check at all times, so that meant no eating people or livestock, no disturbing your neighbors, and if your bear did get into trouble, you would either get hit with a fine or be banned from having a house bear. So maybe it's best to stick with normal pets like dogs. At number 2, worthy kids. The Vikings were ruthless even when it came to their spawn. I mean their kids. These guys were really picky when it came to having a family because they weren't afraid to just yeet their kids if they didn't like them enough. Back in their day, when a baby was born, they would christen their kid with a name during a ceremony called Asavatni, but only after determining if this kid was even worth raising in the first place. You see, when a baby was delivered, the child would be placed on the ground for the father to then pick up and examine. He would be looking for any physical deformities, disabilities, and to determine if the kid was actually his or not. He would decide if the kid had a future. If they did, then they would hold the Asavatni ceremony where water was sprinkled on the kid's head and given a name, and if they weren't worthy, then they would be left outside in the elements and abandoned. And finally, at number 1, criminal profiling. It turns out that the Vikings kind of invented criminal profiling. You see, when the Viking horde would set off to battle, there was no telling how they would return. You have to remember that these guys were bloodthirsty and violent, and there was no telling what was going on in their heads. I mean, don't even get me started on the whole berserker rage thing because that itself is very intense. But basically, when the horde would return home, they seemed to have caused a lot of problems because many of them couldn't turn off their rage and would just wreak havoc on the town. To deal with this, it is said that a series of Icelandic sagas were written as a sort of profile to warn the homegrown Vikings of what to look out for when the others would return. They had to kind of alter their stories a little bit because if they were too specific, then it would have caused people to learn to be afraid of basically any Viking man, so they had to keep things a little generic, but for the most part, people learned to stay away from those who couldn't turn off the berserker rage at home in order to keep themselves and the rest of their community safe.